Imagine possessing the power of a god, only to spend your final days in total darkness, waiting for a 60-second window to destroy an empire. This is the anatomy of a broken hero. It does not begin with a prophecy. It does not begin with an angel in a field or a lion torn apart by bare hands. The real story begins the moment the light dies. Gaza, the lowest circle of a man-made hell. Feel the cold stone beneath your bleeding feet. Smell the heavy, suffocating scent of grain dust and stale sweat. And listen. Listen to the sound of metal scraping against metal. They took his eyes first, not just to blind him, but to break his mind. The Philistines did not want to kill Samson. Death would have made him a martyr. They wanted to humiliate him. They wanted to take the weapon of Israel, the apex predator of the ancient world, and turn him into a beast of burden. When the bronze blades pierced his eyes, it was not just physical agony. It was the sudden, violent death of an identity. For his entire life, his eyes had been his compass and his curse. He saw what he wanted, and he took it. He saw the lion, and he crushed it. He saw Delilah, and he fell. But now, the man who lived entirely through the dominance of his physical senses was plunged into a void. The 0th second of darkness was not an event. It was the beginning of a living death. The strongest man alive was now entirely defenseless against his own thoughts. Step after step, circle after circle, pushing a grinding stone that weighed thousands of kilograms. Minutes bled into hours, and hours bled into days. But in the dark, time loses its meaning. You cannot measure time without the sun. The guards would change shifts every 12 hours, their heavy footsteps echoing off the damp walls. But for him, it was just one endless, suffocating night. He could hear the rats scurrying in the corners, measuring the space of his cage not in meters, but in the echoes of their claws. His hands, once capable of snapping thick ropes like dry twigs, were now covered in blisters from the rough, unyielding surface of the millstone. The sheer weight of the stone, over 2,000 kilograms of solid rock, was designed to break the spirit of beasts, let alone a man. They thought they were punishing his body. They did not realize they were forcing a man who had never sat still a day in his life to finally face the terrifying silence of his own mind. The physical pain of his gouged eyes was nothing compared to the psychological torture of sensory deprivation. In the quiet, the ego starves. All the applause of the crowds, the terrified screams of his enemies, the sweet lies whispered by the woman who betrayed him, it all faded away. He was left with nothing but the friction of the stone and the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He was broken, utterly and completely shattered. But what the Empire of Philistia failed to understand about structural integrity is that when you tear down a building to its bare foundation, you expose the only part of it that cannot be broken. In the suffocating blackness of the prison in Gaza, stripping away the hero, the legend, and the pride, left behind something far more dangerous. A man who had absolutely nothing left to lose, waiting for just 1 minute, 60 agonizing seconds, to bring the entire world crashing down. Have you ever been completely alone? Not just physically separated from others, but isolated in a way that makes you question your own existence. Psychologists today understand the devastating effects of sensory deprivation. When the brain is starved of input, no sunlight, no faces, no conversation, it begins to turn on itself. In the grinding mill of Gaza, Samson was not just a prisoner. He was a subject in an ancient, brutal psychological experiment. Push, step, push, step. The endless, nauseating circle of the mill. There was no day, there was no night, only the friction of the stone. In this absolute silence, the ego cannot survive. Out in the open valleys, Samson was a legend. He was loud, he was impulsive, he was untouchable. But in the dark, muscles mean nothing. You cannot punch the dark. You cannot choke isolation. The Philistines thought they were extracting physical labor from him, but what they were actually doing, without realizing it, was stripping away the noise of the world. They were forcing a man who had spent his entire life running from himself to finally sit still. Imagine the physical toll first. The rough wooden beam pressing against his bruised shoulders. His bare feet slipping on the grain-covered stone floor. Every step required a monumental exertion of force just to keep the massive millstone turning. He walked for hours, maybe days, maybe weeks. The concept of time dissolved completely. He only knew the rhythm of his own exhaustion. He would push until his muscles screamed in agony, until he collapsed on the filthy floor, only to be whipped back to his feet by the unseen guards. But the physical exhaustion was merely a distraction from the real torture. The true horror was the silence. When you take away a person's sight, their hearing becomes hyper-acute. He could hear the dripping of water somewhere deep in the prison walls. He could hear the scratching of insects. He could hear the ragged, desperate sound of his own breathing. And worse, he could hear his own thoughts. For a man who had lived his entire life in the external world, conquering women, fighting armies, performing feats of unimaginable strength, the internal world was a terrifying wasteland. He had never spent a single day cultivating patience. He had never learned the art of quiet reflection. His mind was a chaotic storm of unresolved trauma, unacknowledged guilt, and a deep, agonizing sense of betrayal. In the sensory void of the Gaza mill, those thoughts became deafening. The brain, desperate for stimulation, began to manufacture it. Sensory deprivation often leads to hallucinations. He would see flashes of light that were not there. He would hear Delilah whispering his name in the dark, her voice dripping with that familiar, intoxicating poison. He would reach out to grab her, only to scrape his raw hands against the cold, unfeeling stone of the prison wall. The cruelest part of this isolation protocol was the complete removal of his identity. There were no audiences to applaud his strength. There were no enemies cowering in fear. He was reduced to a machine, an ox grinding grain for the very people he was meant to destroy. This is how you break a demigod. You do not defeat him in battle. You lock him in a box, take away the sun, and let his own mind eat him alive. The sensory deprivation broke his arrogance. It stripped him down to his most vulnerable, pathetic state. But in that terrifying vacuum, a new kind of clarity began to form. The noise of his ego was finally silenced, preparing the ground for something he had ignored his entire life. In the silence of the mill, the ghosts come. Post-traumatic stress is not a modern invention. It is the inescapable tax collected by violence, and Samson had committed violence on a scale that defies human comprehension. 1,000 men, slain with the jawbone of a donkey. We read that in the ancient texts and think of it as a heroic statistic, but close your eyes and think about the brutal reality of it. The human skull is a remarkably resilient structure. It takes an enormous amount of kinetic energy to shatter one. Now, multiply that physical impact by 1,000 times. In the dark, Samson relived it. Every swing, every scream, every sickening crunch of bone giving way under his hands. The jawbone of a donkey is a fragile, dry piece of skeletal remain. It should have shattered on the very first strike, but it did not. It became a horrifying extension of his wrath. Imagine the sheer, mechanical repetition of it. Lifting your arm, swinging it down. The impact, the spray of warm red fluid, over and over, until your muscles burn like fire and your lungs scream for oxygen. The Philistine soldiers were not just faceless targets. They were fathers, brothers, sons. In the total darkness of the Gaza prison, his mind forced him to look at their faces. He remembered the raw terror in the eyes of the 100th man, the sheer disbelief of the 500th, and the paralyzed despair of the final few who could not even run away because the bodies were stacked too high. They knew they were walking into a meat grinder, yet they kept coming, and he kept killing, taking 1,000 lives, extinguishing 1,000 futures. When you take a life, even in self-defense, it leaves a permanent scar on your psyche. When you take 1,000, it erases your humanity completely. As he pushed the heavy, grinding stone in a perpetual circle, his mind trapped in the sensory void, the adrenaline of that day was long gone, leaving only the crushing weight of reality. What had he actually accomplished on that hill of corpses? Did he negotiate a peace treaty? Did he build a fortress for his people? Did he establish laws or schools or a functional society? No. He merely built a mountain of dead flesh. He realized, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that he had never been a true leader. He was a biological weapon, pointed at an enemy and unleashed. The people of Israel did not love him. They feared him. They used him. They hid behind his terrifying strength, but they never wanted to sit at a table with him. He was a monster kept on a loose leash. The ghosts of the 1,000 Philistines did not haunt him because they were angry enemies seeking revenge from the grave. They haunted him because their lifeless eyes reflected the absolute emptiness of his own existence. He had the physical strength to conquer an entire army, but he lacked the emotional intelligence to conquer his own ego. He had mistaken fear for respect and massive violence for a life purpose. In the pitch black of his cell, the tears that fell from his ruined eye sockets were not tears of physical pain. They were tears of profound, soul-crushing grief. He mourned not just for the men he had destroyed, but for the man he was supposed to be. The angel had promised his mother a deliverer. Instead, she got a butcher. The silence of the prison amplified the screams of his past, a relentless symphony of regret that played 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no end in sight. The true weight of 1,000 skulls was not physical. It was the unbearable gravity of a wasted destiny. Why do the chosen ones destroy themselves? The tragedy of Samson and Delilah is rarely understood. We paint Delilah as a master seductress and Samson as a fool blinded by lust. But human psychology is much darker and much sadder than that. This was not about lust. This was about self-sabotage. To understand the anatomy of his downfall, you have to understand the crushing isolation of power. When you are born a golden child, a Nazirite dedicated to God before you even take your first breath, the pressure is incomprehensible. You are not allowed to be human. You are not allowed to fail. You are a living weapon, a divine instrument, but you are never just a man. Subconsciously, Samson wanted out. He wanted to be broken. Think about the sheer absurdity of the story. He goes to the valley of Sorek. He falls in love with a woman who belongs to the very people he is supposed to destroy. And then the betrayal begins. Not once, not twice, but 3 times she explicitly tries to hand him over to his executioners. 3 times he wakes up to Philistine assassins in his bedroom. 3 times he breaks the ropes, the fresh bowstrings, the woven fabric of the loom. He knew exactly what she was doing. He was a tactical genius who had outsmarted entire armies. He was not stupid, yet he stayed. He stayed because trauma bonding is a powerful, blinding drug. When you have lived your entire life surrounded by people who only want to use you for your strength, you start to believe that your physical power is the only valuable thing about you. Delilah did not love him, but she gave him something no one else ever had. She gave him a space where he could finally lay his heavy head down and be completely vulnerable. Imagine the sheer exhaustion of never being able to sleep deeply, always keeping one eye open, always carrying the weight of a nation on your shoulders. He handed her the secret of his strength, the absolute truth about his uncut hair, because the burden of being invincible was simply too heavy to carry for another day. He meticulously engineered his own downfall. He practically handed her the scissors. He wanted her to cut his hair, hoping that if he lost his divine strength, he could finally just be a normal, flawed human being. He thought that if the power was gone, the crushing expectations would vanish with it, and he could finally rest. It was an act of profound psychological suicide. But the world does not let gods become normal men. It does not forgive fallen heroes. It puts them in bronze chains. When he woke up that final time and realized that the Spirit of the Lord had left him, it was not a sudden punishment striking down from the heavens. It was the inevitable conclusion of a man who had systematically dismantled his own life piece by piece. The real betrayal was not Delilah cutting his hair while he slept. The real betrayal was Samson cutting himself off from his own destiny. In the suffocating darkness of the Gaza mill, as he pushed the heavy stone for hours on end, the memory of her betrayal was a sharp, physical ache in his chest. But deeper than the anger towards the woman who sold him for pieces of silver was the horrifying realization of his own complicity. He had built the walls of his own prison long before the Philistines ever forged his bronze shackles. He had actively craved his own destruction because, in his twisted, exhausted mind, destruction felt like the only possible escape from the suffocating loneliness of being the chosen one. Rock bottom is a very specific place. It is not just a bad day or a tragic week. It is the absolute zero of the human soul. It is the moment when hope is entirely gone, when the ego has been starved to death, and when you finally realize that you are completely, utterly powerless. But rock bottom is also a foundation. In the crushing darkness of the Gaza prison, weeks turned into months. The sharp, piercing agony of his gouged eyes slowly dulled into a permanent, heavy ache. The blisters on his hands calloused over into thick, unfeeling armor. And then, a sensation. Slow, creeping. Unnoticed by the guards who mocked him. Unnoticed by the politicians who celebrated above him. Unnoticed by the entire world. His hair was growing back. Now, you must understand the psychology of this moment. The hair itself was not magic. Divine power does not live in dead cells and keratin follicles. The hair was a symbol. It was the physical manifestation of the Nazirite vow, a covenant he had treated like a cheap parlor trick his entire life. When he was free, walking in the sunlight, his long hair was a crown of arrogance. It was a statement of his own invincibility. But here, in the suffocating blackness, where no one could see him, the slow regrowth of his hair meant something entirely different. It meant surrender. For the first time in his chaotic, violent life, Samson stopped fighting. He stopped demanding. He stopped acting on blind impulse. The man who had always used his physical strength to force the world to bend to his will was now forced to simply exist in a state of absolute submission. The days in the Gaza prison bled together. Time was no longer measured by the movement of the sun, but by the relentless scraping of the millstone. Yet, in this endless loop of suffering, a microscopic rebellion was taking place. Hair by hair, strand by strand, the keratin pushed through his scarred scalp. He could feel it when he laid his heavy head against the damp, freezing stone floor to sleep. It was a tactile reminder of the God he had abandoned, and the God who, inexplicably, had not abandoned him. He did not try to speed it up. He did not boast. The regrowth of his hair was not just a biological process. It was the quiet, unseen resurrection of his soul. Every single millimeter of new growth was a silent prayer from a broken man who had finally learned how to be quiet. The ego that once demanded the attention of thousands was now dead and buried under the grain dust. What remained was something elemental, pure purpose, refined in the crucible of absolute agony. Imagine the terrifying patience of it, waiting in the dark, feeling the coarse strands brush against his scarred shoulders. He did not shout. He did not threaten the guards who whipped his bleeding back. He just kept pushing the heavy, grinding stone, round and round, letting them believe they had won. The empire of Philistia was celebrating their victory, drinking wine and praising their false god of grain, completely unaware of the fatal error they had made in their arrogance. They had focused entirely on neutralizing the physical threat. They bound his arms with heavy bronze and took his eyes, believing that a blind, chained man was a defeated man. They did not realize that by taking away his sight, they had forced him to look inward. By taking away his freedom, they had forced him to find discipline. While the world above ground thought the weapon was dismantled and thrown away, the most dangerous entity on earth was being forged in the dark. A man with no ego, no fear of death, and absolutely nothing left to lose. A weapon that no longer needed to see its target to destroy it. The silent regrowth in the Gaza mill was the calm before the most devastating storm the ancient world had ever seen. Above the suffocating darkness of the prison, the sun was shining, bathed in the golden light of a civilization celebrating its own fatal arrogance. Welcome to the Temple of Dagon in Gaza. This was not just a place of worship. It was a masterclass in ancient engineering and a colossal monument to human hubris. Picture a massive, towering structure of cut stone and heavy timber, specifically designed to hold a staggering weight. The entire architectural integrity of this massive building relied entirely on two central, load-bearing pillars. If those two pillars shifted even a fraction of a meter, the entire structure would experience a catastrophic failure. Inside the grand hall and up on the sprawling roof, 3,000 of the Philistine elite had gathered. These were not the common laborers or the foot soldiers. These were the 5 lords of the Philistines, the elite military commanders, the wealthy politicians, and the high-ranking aristocrats. They were the very architects of Samson's misery, dressed in fine linen and dripping with gold. They were gathered to celebrate what we can analyze as the Dagon paradox. The Dagon paradox is the dangerous, intoxicating delusion of the crowd. They looked at their captive, a single, blinded, chained man, and they extrapolated that singular event into a sweeping, cosmic victory. They truly believed that their God of grain and agriculture had definitively defeated the God of Israel. They believed that by capturing the physical vessel of that chaotic energy, they had somehow conquered the supreme power itself. This is the blinding, intoxicating nature of collective arrogance. When a civilization, or an individual, reaches the absolute peak of its perceived power, it loses its essential paranoia. It stops looking for threats in the shadows. It becomes sloppy. Hubris makes intelligent people, even brilliant military minds who had survived decades of brutal warfare, do incredibly stupid things. As the hours passed and the wine flowed, the height of their drunken revelry began to peak. Enveloped in the deafening noise of their own self-congratulation, they felt a desperate, pathological need to validate their absolute supremacy. Simply winning the war was no longer enough. They needed to publicly humiliate the loser. They needed to look down upon the monster that had terrorized their borders for 20 years and see him reduced to a pathetic, crawling animal. Someone among the leadership, driven by the intoxicating poison of the crowd's energy, made a fatal suggestion. Bring Samson out of the dungeon. Let him perform for us. Let us look upon the broken weapon of Israel and laugh. They gave the order to the guards stationed in the dark depths below. They thought they were bringing out a broken, defective toy to mock, a toothless lion to kick around in a cage. They wanted a grand spectacle to serve as the crowning moment of their glorious festival. But they entirely lacked the psychological depth to understand the profound transformation that had occurred in the absolute silence of the grinding mill below their feet. They did not understand the quiet regrowth of his hair, nor the chilling surrender of his soul. They did not realize that by dragging him out of the dark, they were personally inviting the ultimate executioner into the very heart, the very structural center of their civilization. They were so utterly blinded by the bright sunlight, the flowing wine, and their own inflated egos that they could not perceive the terrifying reality of the situation. They failed to understand a fundamental truth of human psychology. A man who has lost his physical sight, who has had his arrogant ego completely stripped away and his grand illusions brutally shattered, is a man who can finally see the world with absolute, crystal clarity. They were willingly opening the reinforced doors of their grand temple to a dead man walking, a walking ghost who had already accepted his own demise and was merely waiting for the perfect architectural moment to collect his final, devastating tax. The 3,000 elites of Philistia were not throwing a victory party. They were, unknowingly, happily attending their own mass funeral. The heavy iron and wood doors of the dungeon groan open. For the first time in months, sunlight violently assaults his face. Even without eyes, the sudden, blistering heat of the noon sun is overwhelming. But it is not the light that hits him the hardest. It is the noise. A shockwave of sound crashes into him. 3,000 voices, roaring, jeering, laughing. It is the sound of an entire civilization celebrating its perceived invincibility. A young servant boy is sent to fetch him, grabbing the end of his heavy bronze chain and leading him forward. The strongest man in human history, the apex predator who once tore a lion apart with his bare hands, is now shuffling forward like an invalid, being led by a child. Every step toward the center of the grand temple of Dagon is an agonizing walk of public humiliation. They throw spoiled fruit at him. They spit on his scarred chest. They scream insults that echo off the massive stone walls. But look closely at his face. Beneath the dirt, the dried blood, and the disfiguring scars of his gouged eyes, there is no anger. There is no panic. There is a terrifying, absolute stillness. The noise of the crowd does not bother him. The insults wash over him like water over stone. When you have survived the maddening, suffocating silence of the Gaza mill, when you have faced the darkest, most twisted corners of your own mind and survived, the arrogant noise of drunken men means absolutely nothing. His physical eyes are gone, but his mind is crystal clear. His remaining senses, sharpened to a razor edge by months of total sensory deprivation, are operating at maximum capacity. He feels the shift in the air pressure as he moves from the open courtyard into the grand hall. He smells the overpowering stench of cheap wine, roasted meat, and unwashed bodies packed tightly together. But most importantly, he listens. He listens to the acoustic echo of the vast space. He calculates the distance between the walls. He feels the micro-vibrations in the floorboards under his bare feet, caused by the sheer weight of the 3,000 people standing on the roof above. He maps out the architecture of the temple not with his eyes, but with his skin, his hearing, and his intuition. He knows exactly what kind of structure he is standing inside. He feels the immense, crushing gravity bearing down on the center of the room. The servant boy tugs at his chain, impatient and disgusted. Samson stops. He leans his head down, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a dying star. "Place me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple," he says to the boy, "so that I may lean against them, for I am tired." The boy, oblivious to the catastrophic danger, leads him to the exact structural center of the building. Samson reaches out. His thick, calloused hands, covered in the rough scars of the grinding stone, meet the cold, smooth surface of the stone pillars. He wraps his palms around the massive circumference. He runs his fingers over the foundational joints. In that single, quiet moment, amidst the deafening roar of 3,000 mocking voices, a profound realization settles over him. He can feel the tension in the stone. He can feel the thousands of tons of timber and rock pressing down on this singular point of failure. He is not just touching two pieces of architecture. He is holding the beating heartbeat of the Philistine Empire in his hands. The crowd laughs louder, watching the blind fool hug the pillars for support. They see a broken, defeated animal. They do not see the dead man walking, taking his final, terrifying breath. Time slows down. The deafening roar of the screaming crowd fades into a distant, muffled hum, like the sound of the ocean heard from deep underwater. We are now in the final 60 seconds of his life. He does not flex his muscles. He does not scream a blood-curdling battle cry to intimidate his enemies. He simply bows his scarred, weary head. For his entire adult life, Samson had used the Spirit of the Lord as a personal battery pack, an infinite resource to tap into when he wanted revenge, when he wanted to show off his physical superiority, when he wanted to win a meaningless bet, or when he needed to slaughter an army to protect his own bruised ego. But not this time. Standing between the cold stone pillars of the Temple of Dagon, his final prayer is a masterclass in absolute psychological brokenness. Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. Analyze those words carefully. Pull them apart and notice exactly what he does not say. He does not ask for his life back. He does not ask for his eyesight to be miraculously restored so he can see the sun one last time. He does not ask for a hidden escape route or an army of angels to rescue him. He knows with absolute certainty that he is a dead man. He has fully accepted his own mortality. Instead, he is asking to be a vessel, one last time, to finally fulfill the grand, terrifying purpose that he had squandered his entire life actively avoiding. This is the ultimate, destructive power of true surrender. When you finally stop fighting for your own fragile, demanding ego and willingly offer your broken pieces to a purpose much larger than yourself, you become incredibly dangerous. A current of unseen energy, cold, ancient, and unfathomably heavy, begins to flood into his ruined veins. It is not his own strength. He can feel the stark difference. His own strength was hot, chaotic, and driven by anger. This new strength is silent, calculated, and absolute. It is borrowed power. He takes a long, slow breath, filling his lungs with the stale, dusty air of the grand hall. The chaotic noise of the 3,000 elites laughing and drinking on the roof above him now sounds like nothing more than the meaningless buzzing of flies. They have absolutely no idea that the broken, blind animal they are so joyfully mocking has just made direct contact with the divine force of the universe. He slowly adjusts his grip on the rough stone. His calloused right hand presses flat against the massive pillar to his right. His left hand finds the exact center of the pillar to his left. The entire structural integrity of the Philistine Empire, thousands of tons of timber, gold, and rock, is resting right under his bleeding palms. He can physically feel the exact point of architectural balance. 50 seconds left. 40 seconds left. He does not rush. He waits with terrifying patience for the borrowed power to reach its absolute peak, letting it flow through his calloused skin, knitting together his torn muscles and reinforcing his bones with the density of iron. This is the quietest, most disciplined moment of his entire chaotic existence. The impulsive, arrogant boy who chased women and picked fights is completely dead. What stands between these pillars now is a cold, calculated executioner, calmly preparing to pull the lever on a guillotine that will behead an entire civilization. Let me die with the Philistines. The final 10 seconds. He locks his arms. He plants his bare, bleeding feet against the rough stone floor. And he pushes. It does not happen instantly. Real destruction never does. First, there is the sound of agonizing biological tension. You can hear the thick ligaments in his shoulders snapping like over-tightened ropes. You can hear the muscle fibers in his back and chest tearing under an impossible, inhuman stress. Blood vessels burst beneath his scarred skin. But he does not stop. He channels every ounce of that ancient, borrowed energy into his palms. And then, a sound that makes the 3,000 people on the roof freeze in absolute terror. A deep, guttural crack. Micro-fractures appear in the solid stone pillars. The dust begins to fall from the ceiling. The laughter of the elites dies in their throats. The foundation, designed to hold thousands of tons of weight for centuries, begins to shift off its base. Samson pushes with the relentless, unstoppable force of a tectonic plate. The structural integrity of the temple groans in agony. The massive wooden beams holding the roof begin to splinter and snap. The crowd realizes too late what is happening. Their arrogant cheers dissolve into a collective, deafening scream of pure panic. People scramble, trampling over each other in the bright sunlight, but there is nowhere to run. They are suspended in the air on a platform held up by the very man they brought out to torture. And then, gravity, the ultimate and unforgiving judge, takes over. The massive pillars buckle and slide completely off their pedestals. The center of the roof caves in. A catastrophic tidal wave of stone, heavy timber, gold, and human bodies collapses inward in a terrifying implosion of dust and blood. 3,000 of the most powerful people in the ancient world, the lords, the commanders, the politicians, are swallowed by the earth in a fraction of a second. They are crushed under the weight of their own monumental hubris. Samson dies in the rubble, crushed, broken, buried under the ruins of his enemies. He wiped out the entire leadership of the Philistine Empire in his final breath, destroying more in his death than he ever did in his entire chaotic life. But as the thick dust settles over the ruins of Gaza, and the screams fade into a chilling silence, a profound truth remains. We must stop telling this story as a simple fairy tale of a strong man. Samson was never a perfect hero. He was a deeply flawed, selfish, and traumatized human being. He was a weapon that destroyed everything he touched, including himself. But in his final moment, in the absolute zero of his ruin, stripped of his pride, his eyes, and his freedom, he reached out into the dark, and he was answered. Because true strength is not about having unbreakable muscles or living a perfect life. True strength is about what you choose to do in the absolute dark, when everything is lost, right before the end.